Hi, so I want to talk about Galatians chapter 6, and there are two particular verses that I want to speak about. In fact, a particular word. Now in Galatians chapter 6 verse 2, we are told to bear one another's burden, right? But then in verse 5, Paul says each one should bear his own burden. So I want to talk about what seems to be a conflict. In some person's mind, it may seem conflicting. So let's go to, first of all, I want to talk about the meaning of bear. So let's go to our Greek lexicon, go to our Greek interlinear, and then we go to the Greek lexicon to find the meaning of the word bear. And it comes from the root. The word here used is come from the root bastadso. Bastadso. And it literally means I carry or bear, I carry away, or I carry or take away. Going to the Strong's, not the Strong's, the Thayer's lexicon. Thayer's lexicon gives the general meaning of the word as used both in the Bible and outside of the Bible. It gives the meaning of the word as to take up with the hands. So for example, in John 10:31, when they took up stones to stone Jesus, that's the same word, to take up with the hands. Then another meaning of the word is to take up in order to carry or bear, to put upon oneself something to be carried. It means to bear with a burdensome. Bear what is burdensome. And there are examples of that. For example, in John 19 verse 17, when the Bible speaks about Jesus taking up his cross, bearing his own cross, and he went out to the place called a skull, right? That's an example of how that word is used in that sense. But so by extension, Thayer's tells us that by extension, Galatians 6 must take upon himself the condemnation of the judge. Galatians 5 verse 10. Alright, that's an example of that. And hence it also means to bear or to endure. And here are some examples of how that word is used to mean to bear or to endure. Matthew 20 verse 12. When Jesus gave the parable of the laborers who came in at different times, and one of them said, but these came just now. We have been here bearing the heat of the day. We have been enduring the heat of the day. We're not carrying it. We were enduring the heat of the day. Let's look at another example. Acts chapter 15 verse 10. When the first council in Jerusalem met, because there was an issue where the Gentile Christians were being forced to circumcise and to follow the whole law. And they had a council, and James says, look, we are trying to put a burden upon these Gentiles that neither we nor our fathers could not bear. In other words, could not endure. Let's look at another reference. Romans 15:1. And this one is very pointed because it relates so much to what Galatians 6 is saying. We ought to bear. We who are strong ought to bear with, ought to endure the weaknesses, the infirmities of those who are weak. Alright, same word. And so that brings us to Galatians chapter 6 verse 2. Paul says that we should bear one another's burden. What it means is we should endure with one another. Revelation 2 verse 2 also speaks, Christ speaking to one of the churches. He said, I know your works. And he says that I know your labor and your endurance, your patience, that you are not able to bear, to tolerate the evil ones. So that's another word that could be used. Tolerate. We ought to bear, endure, tolerate each other's burdens. All right? Now, let's talk about that burdensome word. Pun intended. Now, the word that is used in verse 2 is baros. Baros. And what it means is a weight, burden. All right? Going to the Greek lexicon, Thayer's Greek lexicon, heaviness, weight, trouble, load. All right? And in this context, let me go into the context of verse 2, where it is used of troublesome moral faults. Troublesome moral faults. The meaning here is to bear one another's faults, to endure each other's moral failures, to endure with each other's moral failures. And if you look back at the verse, at the passage rather, you'll see where Paul says that if a man be overtaken or is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. So in other words, I am to look at my neighbor's faults and recognize that my job is to help to restore that person, because I myself can be tempted. You know, there are some persons who say, oh, that could never happen to me. I hear T.D. Jakes say something and it's forever etched in my mind, where he says that I will never say that will never happen to me, because bound up in this flesh is every sin. Every sin is bound up in this flesh. Right? So Paul says, with that in mind, endure with one another's faults. And verse 3 says, well, let me finish what verse 2 says. And so fulfill the law of Christ. What's the law of Christ? Love one another. Proverbs says, love shall cover a multitude. And James repeats that, shall cover a multitude of sin or a multitude of wrong. For if anyone thinks himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. So you deceive yourself to think that you are above that, and you could not do that, and you would never do this. Or, okay, maybe you wouldn't do that, but you do something else. All right? So we ought to recognize that we are human beings, and therefore we must endure, be patient with each other's faults and failures. Now let's go to verse 5. Verse 5 said, for each. Well, let me read what verse 4 says. But let each one examine his own work, and then he will have rejoicing in himself alone, and not in another. I'll soon explain that. For each one shall bear his own burden. Now let's go to that word. That word. So we go back to our interlinear. And for those of you who don't know, I'm using Bible Hub. So it's a great tool you can use to find a lot of help. Where if you don't have the actual books, some of us have the actual books, but if you don't have the actual books, like the Greek lexicon, Thayer's Greek lexicon, or Strong's Concordance, you can and the various translations, you can go to Bible Hub. Right? Now in verse 6, the word that is translated in the King James Version as burden is the word phortion. 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 It's spelled P-H-O-R-T-I-O-N. And it's a burden, the freight of a ship. Let me go down to Thayer's. It's a burden or load of the freight of a laden of a ship. So this word literally associates with a cargo being carried by a ship. I hope you see where this is going. This particular cargo or burden is what is being carried by the ship itself. Alright? Let me go to word help, because I like what they say here. Properly, a burden which must be carried by the individual. That is, as something personal, and hence is not transferable. That is, it cannot be shifted to someone else. Interesting. Interesting. So in Galatians 5 then, Galatians 6 verse 5, it's speaking about the false consciousness of which oppresses the soul. In verse 5, the load, the burden, load, cargo, is carried by the individual. In other words, the burden of your sinful actions, the consequence of your sinful actions, you must bear that. You cannot shift blame to somebody else. So each one must carry his own burden. Each one must carry his own blame. You cannot shift blame to somebody else for your faults. Do you see the difference? In verse 2, we are told to endure, be patient with people's moral failings. But in verse 5, Paul is reminding us, although we are bearing with you, you must bear the consequences. You must take responsibility for your actions. You cannot shift blame. Now, in verse 4, where Paul says that, but let each one examine his own work, then he will have rejoicing in himself alone and not in another. I believe that this refers back to, you have to read the whole book of Galatians to get the essence, which I encourage students to do. You must read the text in context, all right? Which means including the whole book itself. In the book of Galatians, Paul addressed the matter of the Judaizers who came down to Galatia to tell the people, the Gentile Christians, that they were to be circumcised and keep the whole law, or else they are not Christians. And so Paul had an issue with that, and he rebuked the Galatians for he believed that. Now, one of the things that Paul said in the book of Galatians is that these men were trying to gain points. I'm putting it in modern language. Were trying to gain points so they could boast, to say how many Gentiles they have proselytized, they have gotten to circumcise and to keep the whole law, and so that it would count towards their points, so that they could have reason to boast. So I believe it's a reference to that statement, or to that scenario. Let each one examine his own work, and then he will have rejoicing in himself. In other words, those Judaizers needed to also examine their own lives to see if they were living up to the moral standards of God, because everyone shall bear his own burden. You cannot shift that to anybody else. I hope that explaining these two words, or this word in these two contexts, or these two verses, has helped to shed light on maybe what may have been a confusing statement to you, where Paul in one verse says we should bear one another's burden, and then he says in another verse down, everyone must bear his burden. In the first instance, it is saying we should endure with, be patient with, tolerate the moral weaknesses and failings of an individual, of our brothers and sisters. But in the other verse, it is saying you, the individual, must carry your own load. You must bear the consequences of your actions. God bless you.